The crystal goblet trembled in her grip as she watched 3 drops of clear liquid vanish into the crimson wine. It was a guaranteed death sentence for the most dangerous man in New York. He met her gaze, knew it was spiked, and drank it anyway. The next morning, he did not order her execution. He ordered a priest. The chandelier light shattered into 1,000,000 sharp fragments across the ballroom of the Ricci Syndicate penthouse in Manhattan. Below the glittering glass, the room was filled with monsters disguised in bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. Lydia Fontana stood near the catering doors, her breath hitching in her chest as she straightened her black uniform. It was tight, the fabric clinging to her thick thighs and full hips in a room where women starved themselves to look like porcelain dolls. But Lydia was not here to look beautiful. She was here to commit a murder. Her hands shook as she uncorked a bottle of vintage red wine. Inside her apron pocket rested a tiny glass vial. It had been given to her 2 hours ago by Vanessa Falcone, the venomous underboss of the Brooklyn faction. Vanessa had cornered Lydia in the kitchen alley, flanked by 2 armed enforcers. The threat was simple and devastating. Lydia's younger brother owed the Falcone family a gambling debt of $250,000. Vanessa wanted absolute control of the city, and the only man standing in her way was the cold, untouchable Don of the Ricci family. Vanessa told Lydia to pour the poison, or her brother would be sent home in garbage bags. But Vanessa had underestimated the chubby, quiet Maid. Lydia had not always scrubbed floors for the criminal elite. Before her family went bankrupt, she had been a top-tier biochemistry student. When Lydia smelled the bitter almond scent of the vial Vanessa handed her, she knew it was a fast-acting cyanide derivative. Left alone in the pantry, Lydia had used the catering kitchen's cleaning supplies and her own emergency asthma medication to frantically alter the chemical structure of the poison. She could not refuse the task without getting her brother killed, but she refused to become a murderer. The altered liquid would induce a drastic drop in blood pressure and temporary paralysis. It would look exactly like a lethal heart attack. It would buy time. Lydia walked into the lion's den. At the head of the room sat Luca Ricci. He was a terrifying force of nature, a man carved from marble and violence. Broad-shouldered, towering, and exuding a lethal calm, Luca surveyed the ballroom, with eyes as empty and cold as a frozen lake. He wore a dark, tailored suit that failed to hide the predatory shift of his muscles. Everyone in the underworld knew that Luca Ricci did not have a heart. He had wiped out 3 rival syndicates in Chicago before claiming New York, ruling his empire with calculated, blood-stained precision. As Lydia approached his table, the tray in her hands felt heavier than a coffin. Vanessa Falcone was watching from across the room, a cruel smirk painted on her red lips, swirling a champagne flute. Lydia stepped up to the boss's table. Her soft curves brushed against the edge of the mahogany table, and for a fraction of a second, Luca's eyes flicked from the crowd to her. His gaze moved over her full figure, lingering on the nervous flush of her cheeks and the heavy, rapid rise of her chest. There was a sudden, strange shift in his cold expression, a flicker of dark, possessive interest that made Lydia's stomach twist into knots. She poured the deep red liquid into his glass. Her hands were shaking so violently that a single drop splashed onto the white tablecloth, looking exactly like blood. Luca stared at the stain, then up into her dark, terrified eyes. He did not ask her name. He simply reached out and wrapped his large, scarred hand around her thick wrist. His skin was burning hot against hers. He pulled her slightly closer, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that only she could hear over the classical music playing in the background. "You are trembling, little bird. he murmured, his thumb brushing against her racing pulse. What exactly did you just pour me? Lydia swallowed hard, her mouth completely dry. Just the house red, sir. Luca looked across the room. He caught the predatory, expectant stare of Vanessa Falcone. He was a master of reading rooms, of smelling betrayals before they even materialized. He looked back at Lydia, studying the desperate, protective fire burning behind her panicked eyes. He knew she was a pawn. He knew the wine was compromised, but he also saw the way she stood her ground, refusing to look away, possessing a quiet, stubborn resilience that captivated him instantly. "Let us drink to your health, then," Luca said smoothly. He released her wrist, picked up the glass, and drained it in 3 large swallows. Lydia gasped, stepping back as panic seized her. She watched as Luca set the glass down. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Suddenly, the color drained from his face. His massive hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. A heavy, choked breath escaped his lungs, and the Don of the Ricci family collapsed forward, crashing into the table and sending crystal and porcelain shattering to the marble floor. Screams erupted in the ballroom. Bodyguards flooded the space, drawing weapons. Lydia backed away, blending into the frantic crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Vanessa Falcone slip quietly out the side doors, her coup seemingly successful. The air in the underground cellar of the Ricci compound was freezing, smelling of damp earth, old copper, and fear. Lydia was bound to a heavy wooden chair, a harsh, solitary light bulb hanging above her head. She had been grabbed by 2 men before she could even leave the penthouse block. They had dragged her to Staten Island, throwing her into this windowless room. She had been sitting there for hours, her wrists raw from the rough rope, her uniform torn at the shoulder. She expected a bullet to the head. She expected a brutal beating. What she did not expect was the heavy steel door groaning open and a massive, very much alive Luca Ricci walking into the room. He had shed his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing arms covered in intricate, dark tattoos that coiled around heavy scars. He looked pale, but the lethal energy radiating from him was stronger than ever. He pulled a metal chair from the corner and placed it directly in front of Lydia, sitting down backward. His arms resting on the backrest, he stared at her in silence for a long time. Lydia lifted her chin, refusing to let the tears in her eyes fall. Despite her soft, round face and trembling lip, she held his terrifying gaze. "My doctor tells me I should be dead," Luca began, his voice a quiet, dangerous rumble that echoed off the concrete walls. He drew my blood while I was unconscious. He found a chemical compound he had never seen before, a paralytic that mimicked cardiac arrest, mixed with traces of over-the-counter asthma medication, not cyanide. Luca leaned forward, his face inches from hers. He smelled of dark musk and gunpowder. "Vanessa Falcone does not leave survivors," Luca continued. "She ordered you to kill me, and she gave you a lethal dose. I saw her face in that ballroom. She thought she was watching a murder. But you altered the poison. You risked your own life. You risked the wrath of the entire Falcone family to spare a man you do not even know." "Why?" Lydia took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with a spine of steel. "Because I am not a killer. She told me she would butcher my brother if I did not serve you that wine. If I refused, we both died. If I killed you, your men would have killed me anyway. I had to make her think she won, just long enough for me to get my brother out of the city." Luca's eyes darkened, tracing the curves of her face, the defiant set of her jaw, the way her soft, Heavy chest rose and fell with her uneven breathing. In his world, people were ruthless, selfish, and weak. Men twice her size had wet themselves in this very room, begging for mercy. Yet here sat a poor, plus-sized maid, a woman society overlooked and the underworld treated as disposable garbage, outsmarting one of the deadliest mob bosses in New York. She had held the life of Luca Ricci in her hands. She had absolute power over him in that one moment. And she had chosen mercy. It stirred a violent, obsessive possessiveness in his chest that he had never felt before. "You failed, little bird," Luca said, his tone shifting from cold interrogation to something far deeper, far more dangerous. "You did not get your brother out in time. My men intercepted the Falcone hit squad outside your apartment an hour ago." Lydia let out a choked sob, struggling against the ropes. "No. No, please, tell me he is alive. Please, Luca, I beg you." "He is alive," Luca stated flatly. "He is safe upstairs in my guest wing, under the guard of 5 men with automatic weapons. Vanessa Falcone knows you failed. She knows I am breathing. Right now, there is a $2 million bounty on your soft, beautiful head. You are a dead woman walking, Lydia Fontana." Lydia slumped back in the chair, the fight draining from her as the reality of her situation crushed her. She was trapped in the crossfire of a mafia war. She had no money, no power, and nowhere to run. Luca stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a switchblade. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the blade snapped open. Lydia closed her eyes, preparing for the end. Instead, she felt the cold steel slide against her wrists, cleanly slicing the thick ropes. She rubbed her chafed skin, looking up at him in complete bewilderment. "In my world, a debt of blood is absolute," Luca said, looming over her, casting a massive shadow that swallowed her entirely. "You saved my life. I am claiming yours. Vanessa wants to drag you through the streets to make an example of you. She wants to show the 5 families that anyone who crosses the Falcones dies screaming. But I am not going to let a single soul touch you." "What are you saying?" Lydia whispered, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. Luca reached down, his large, calloused fingers gently gripping her soft jaw, tilting her face up to meet his burning, possessive stare. "I am saying that by sunrise tomorrow, you will not be a maid. You will not be a pawn for the Falcone family to hunt," Luca declared, his thumb stroking her lower lip. "Under the laws of the Cosa Nostra, a boss's wife is untouchable. Any strike against her is an act of total war, punishable by complete annihilation." Lydia's eyes widened in sheer shock. "You cannot be serious. You do not know me. I am nobody. I am just a maid." "You are the woman who brought me to my knees and let me live," Luca corrected, his voice dropping to a raw, territorial growl. "You are smarter than half the men in my syndicate, and braver than the rest. Vanessa Falcone thinks she is playing a game of chess. Tomorrow, I am taking her queen." He leaned down until his lips were a breath away from hers, his cold exterior melting into a dark, intense heat that made Lydia tremble for an entirely different reason. "I am choosing you as my bride, Lydia, and heaven help the man or woman who tries to take you from me." 24 hours later, the grand wooden doors of the Basilica of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral slammed shut, locking the rest of New York City outside. The cavernous church was empty, save for 50 of the most heavily armed men in the Ricci syndicate, forming a perimeter of absolute lethality in the shadows. Standing at the altar was Lydia Fontana. She was no longer wearing the cheap, ill-fitting polyester maid uniform. Instead, she was draped in custom-tailored ivory silk. When Luca had summoned the city's top bridal designer to his Staten Island fortress that morning, the woman had taken one look at Lydia's soft, plus-sized figure and hesitated, muttering about sample sizes. Luca had calmly placed a loaded silver pistol on the glass coffee table and suggested she find a way to make his bride look exactly like the queen she was. The result was breathtaking. The heavy silk clung beautifully to Lydia's full hips and deep curves, cascading into a sweeping train. Her dark hair was pinned up with diamond clips that cost more than the neighborhood she grew up in. Yet beneath the silken diamonds, she was terrified. The reality of marrying the cold, ruthless boss of the Ricci family was a crushing weight. Luca walked down the aisle, completely bypassing traditional wedding marches. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of his polished leather shoes against the marble floor. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that highlighted the dangerous breadth of his shoulders and the savage grace of his movements. When he reached the altar, he did not look at the trembling priest. His dark, consuming gaze was locked entirely on Lydia. He saw the nervous flutter of her eyelashes and the way she tried to fold her hands to make herself appear smaller, a habit ingrained from years of society telling her to take up less space. Luca reached out, his massive, scarred hands engulfing hers. He gently pulled her hands apart, forcing her to stand tall. "Do not shrink yourself for anyone, Lydia," he murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Least of all for me. You are exactly as you should be." The priest stumbled through the Latin rites, his voice echoing nervously off the stained glass windows. When it came time for the vows, Luca did not repeat the standard phrases. He pulled a heavy gold band from his pocket and slid it onto her trembling finger. "I take you, Lydia, as my wife, my equal, and my only weakness," Luca said, loud enough for his capos in the front rows to hear clearly. "My empire is yours. My men are yours. My life is yours. If anyone speaks against you, I will cut out their tongue. If anyone looks at you with disrespect, I will take their eyes. I swear this on my blood and my soul." Lydia stared up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer intensity of his vow, the raw, violent devotion in his eyes, was overwhelming. He was a monster to the world, but in this sacred space, he was offering himself entirely to her. She looked down at the ring, then back up at his handsome, scarred face. She found a well of hidden courage deep within her chest. She had survived poverty. She had survived Vanessa Falcone's poison plot. And she would survive this. "I take you, Luca," she replied, her voice remarkably steady. "I promise to stand by your side. I promise to be your anchor in the dark." Before the priest could pronounce them husband and wife, a deafening explosion shattered the holy silence. The massive stained glass window on the eastern wall blew inward, raining jagged shards of colored glass down upon the pews. Gunfire erupted immediately, the deafening roar of automatic weapons echoing through the cathedral. Vanessa Falcone had not waited for the wedding to end. She had sent an army of hitmen to slaughter them at the altar. Luca moved with terrifying speed. He tackled Lydia to the marble floor, his massive body shielding her entirely from the hail of bullets that chipped away the stone pillars around them. His capos returned fire, turning the sanctuary into a chaotic war zone. Plaster dust choked the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder and blood. "Stay down," Luca roared over the noise, drawing a heavy, matte black pistol from his shoulder holster. He looked down at her, his eyes blazing with a feral, murderous rage. "Are you hit?" "I am fine," Lydia coughed, covering her ears as another volley of bullets shattered the altar behind them. "But they have us pinned down. We cannot stay here." Luca nodded grimly, He signaled to his underboss across the aisle, preparing to lay down suppressive fire. But Lydia, pressed against the cold floor, noticed something the hardened killers had missed. The attackers were advancing through the side vestibule, stepping over the heavy iron grates of the church's ancient heating system. She remembered the blueprints of the historic cathedral from a high school architecture project. Those grates connected directly to the underground boiler room, which was fueled by highly pressurized natural gas lines. "Luca!" Lydia yelled, pulling his tuxedo jacket to get his attention. "The heating grates. If your men shoot the main valve in the vestibule, the gas will flood the entryway. One spark from a muzzle flash, and the entire vestibule will ignite." Luca stared at her, recognizing the brilliant, lethal logic of her biochemistry and structural knowledge. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. He kissed her forehead fiercely. "God, you are magnificent," he whispered. Luca shouted a rapid series of orders in Italian to his sniper in the choir loft. 3 seconds later, a high-caliber round tore through the vestibule wall, severing the main gas line. A loud hissing sound filled the brief lull in gunfire. The Falcone hitmen, ignorant of the danger, fired another round of bullets. The muzzle flash ignited the gas. A massive, localized fireball consumed the vestibule, blowing the attackers back into the street and collapsing the side entrance in a pile of flaming rubble. The immediate threat was neutralized by the sheer intellect of a woman they had underestimated. Luca stood up, pulling Lydia to her feet. The remaining Falcone men were retreating, sirens wailing in the distance. Luca looked at the flaming wreckage, then turned to his bride, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. "Let us go home, Mrs. Ricci," he said smoothly. "We have a war to win." The Falcone syndicate fell apart in less than 48 hours. Luca Ricci unleashed a brutal, unrelenting wave of violence across Brooklyn, systematically dismantling Vanessa Falcone's operations. His men burned her casinos, seized her shipping ports, and executed her capos. But Vanessa herself had retreated to her ultimate stronghold, a heavily fortified chemical manufacturing plant on the edge of the East River. It was a fortress of steel and concrete, surrounded by electrified fencing and armed guards with military-grade hardware. A direct assault would cost Luca dozens of his best men. He sat in the war room of his Staten Island compound, staring at the blueprints of the factory projected onto a screen. He was prepared to lead the charge himself, but Lydia walked into the room, flanked by 2 bodyguards who now treated her with absolute reverence. The men at the table fell silent, parting respectfully to let their new donor approach the table. Lydia had traded her silk wedding gown for dark slacks and a tailored black blouse. She carried a thick leather binder, which she dropped onto the mahogany table. "You do not need to send your men into a meat grinder, Luca," Lydia stated clearly, projecting her voice across the room. The men exchanged skeptical glances, but Luca raised a hand, silencing them instantly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on her with immense pride. "Tell me your plan, Maya Regina," he said softly. Lydia opened the binder, pointing to a schematic of the factory. "Vanessa is using this plant to manufacture synthetic narcotics. I looked at the supply manifests you intercepted yesterday. She is storing massive quantities of anhydrous ammonia and hydrochloric acid on the premises." Lydia looked around the table, meeting the hardened stares of the mobsters. "If we disable the cooling systems in the main storage tanks, the chemicals will undergo a rapid exothermic reaction. It will not cause an explosion, but it will create a highly toxic, corrosive vapor cloud inside the building. The ventilation system will spread it through the entire facility in less than 3 minutes." "What does that do for us?" asked Carlo, Luca's brutal enforcer. "It ruins her entire multi-million-dollar narcotic supply instantly," Lydia explained calmly. and it forces everyone inside to evacuate into the courtyard immediately, or they will suffocate. They will have to abandon their fortified positions and come straight out the front doors. Right into our waiting hands. 0 casualties on our side. The room was dead silent. The capos stared at the plump, soft-spoken woman who had just delivered a masterstroke of tactical warfare using nothing but a chemistry textbook and a supply manifest. Luca stood up, a dark, predatory grin stretching across his face. He walked around the table, wrapped his arm around Lydia's waist, and pulled her flush against his side, claiming her in front of his entire inner circle. "You heard the donor," Luca commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Cut the cooling lines. Flush the rats out." By midnight, the plan was in motion. Luca, Lydia, and a heavily armed strike team watched from a safe distance as the factory's emergency alarms began to wail. Thick, white vapor billowed from the roof vents. Within minutes, the heavily reinforced steel doors of the factory burst open. Dozens of coughing, gasping Falcone guards stumbled out into the courtyard, dropping their weapons as they tried to breathe. Luca's men moved in, like shadows, securing the perimeter and zip-tying the incapacitated guards without firing a single shot. But Vanessa Falcone was not among them. Lydia noticed a heavy steel side door near the loading docks crack open. A lone figure in a dark trench coat was slipping out, heading toward a private speedboat moored at the river's edge. "It is Vanessa," Lydia pointed. "She has a secondary escape route." Luca drew his weapon and sprinted toward the docks, Lydia staying close behind him under the protective cover of Carlo. They cornered Vanessa at the end of the wooden pier. The once glamorous underboss looked unhinged, her hair wild, her eyes wide with desperation as she found herself trapped between the freezing river and Luca Ricci's gun. Vanessa snarled, pulling a small silver revolver from her coat. But before she could aim, Luca shot the weapon right out of her hand. Vanessa screamed, clutching her bleeding fingers and collapsing onto the wooden planks. Luca stepped forward, his face a mask of terrifying indifference, preparing to end her life. "Wait," Lydia said. Her voice cut through the cold night air. Luca paused, stepping aside to let Lydia approach. Vanessa looked up, her face twisting into a sneer of pure hatred as she stared at the woman who had ruined her empire. "You," Vanessa spat, coughing heavily from the chemical exposure. "A fat, pathetic maid. You think you belong in this world? You think he will keep you when he gets bored? You are nothing." Lydia looked down at the pathetic, bleeding woman. She felt no fear, no intimidation. She only felt pity for a woman whose cruelty had ultimately destroyed her. "I am a woman who refused to become a murderer," Lydia said softly, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute power. "And you are a woman who relies on poison because you are too cowardly to fight your own battles. You tried to make me a pawn. Now I am taking your entire board." Lydia turned to Luca. Her calm, dark eyes met his waiting, respectful gaze. "I am done with her," Lydia said. Luca nodded. He did not waste a single word on Vanessa. He simply raised his weapon and fired one clean shot. The threat against Lydia, against her brother, and against the Ricci family was permanently erased. Luca holstered his weapon. He stepped toward Lydia, ignoring the smoking barrel of his gun, the burning factory behind them, and the chaotic aftermath of a mafia war. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing the cold wind from her cheeks. "You are the most dangerous thing in my world, Lydia Ricci," he murmured, leaning down to press a deep, bruising kiss against her lips, sealing their dark, unbreakable bond. "And I will spend the rest of my life worshipping the ground you walk on." The poor chubby maid who was meant to die serving poison had not just survived the underworld. She had conquered it. Did you love the intense, dark romance and thrilling twists of Lydia and Luca's story? This chubby maid proved that brains and resilience can conquer even the most ruthless mafia boss. If you want more gripping, high-stakes drama, do not forget to like this video, drop a comment letting us know your favorite moment, and share it with your friends. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another heart-pounding underworld romance.